I'm Karthik. I head product and content marketing at NGINX. Been here for about 13 months now, since May last year. Really enjoying the ride here at NGINX. All right. So setting the stage initially, just talking about some drivers for API adoption. Some of you guys may, it's probably resonate well with some of these drivers, right? First and foremost, breaking down silos so you have various internal teams, marketing, operations, supply chain, and they all exist in their own silos, their own data point. They have their own data points. APIs are one way to connect and unlock the data that exists in silos. Fosters increased collaboration amongst developers. That's sort of driver for internal API. Another big driver for internal API is microservices, wherein you break a monolith, a three-tier architecture, application, front end, back end, database tier, loosely speaking, into smaller microservices, smaller services that do one thing and one thing only, whether it's checking, billing, retrieving maps, whatever the case may be. And as you break down a monolith into microservices, all of these microservices use APIs to talk to each other. That's another driver for internal APIs, right? Finally, external APIs, as you develop these APIs, they are literally digital. They create new digital revenue streams. They are digital products. So you have Google Maps being used by Uber. Google Maps, I'm sure Google is charging a whole bunch of money to Uber and other folks that use that Maps API. You can basically expose these APIs amongst your customers, suppliers, third-party developers, partners, and again, charge money for that, right? In fact, Salesforce and Expedia, Salesforce close to 50% way back in 2014 comes from APIs, Expedia 90%, again, way back in 2014. Some of these companies that have embraced APIs and cloud for a long time. We did a survey just recently. It's going to be published very soon. If I can move this, hold on. With IDC, 500 enterprises, North America and EMEA, variety of verticals, financial services, healthcare, retail, various titles, architects, developers, API product managers. We'll talk about that. But essentially, you're going to see a surge in APIs right across various different verticals, different countries. Close to 60%, they're going to see a volume increase between 25 and 75% in the next 2 years. Are you guys also seeing something like this in terms of, is it internal or is it external in terms of API usage, or both? Both. So just a quick primer on API management. It entails all these elements that you see there, starting with defining, publishing the APIs. So, you could have from 2, 3 APIs to some companies have 10,000 APIs. What are they? What are those APIs? So define them, publish them to the gateway, publish them to the external third parties that are going to consume it. Security entails 3 main touchpoints, API touchpoints: authenticating, authorizing the API clients, the apps that are consuming your APIs. Is it really Uber that's making the call to Google Maps, or is it somebody else spoofing as Uber, right, and trying to get that data? You want to authenticate and authorize. Can this API access pricing? Versus you may have a setting, you may have a restriction where give me the information about product catalog, everybody can access it, but pricing is only accessible by certain folks, right? So authorizing and authenticating those APIs. Then actually securing the API itself. So making sure you're not attacked by a DDoS. Nobody's making a DDoS attack. Setting rate limits. I can only process 100 API calls per minute or per second, right? That's another aspect. And finally, the backend, making sure the backend that's processing all the APIs using HTTPS, TLS, secure protocols when you're trying to access the backend itself, right? So those are the various elements of security. Traffic management, when an API call is made, how is that call routed? How many gateways do you need? That's the primary purpose of the gateway. Again, figuring out, well, first and foremost, load balancing, request routing based on the call, rate limiting, JOT authentication, all of these functions the API gateway does, and of course, performant. You could potentially should be able to handle a whole bunch of calls, valid authorized API calls every minute, right? And you want a robust performant gateway that can handle that. Once you've set up, you find the APIs, API calls are being made, you have ongoing, your INO folks, infrastructure and operations folks, which API calls are failing, why did it fail? You want a robust monitoring infrastructure. Why is it failing just between 2 and 4 in the morning, right? To be able to answer those questions, you need to be able to monitor all of these, questions around API with regards to API monitoring. So that's for the INO folks. Then you have analytics. Analytics is basically who are the top users of my APIs, which APIs are used most, which APIs are used least. So there's an emerging, and Eric is going to talk very soon about API product manager. This person is basically involved with figuring out, are the APIs that an enterprise is producing, does it make sense? Does it meet the needs of my customers? Does it meet our needs in terms of fulfilling our business objectives? So analytics around just API usage, that's a key element of API lifecycle management. And finally, onboarding in dev portal, something called a developer portal. When you have these APIs for external consumption, catalog of APIs, some sample code, some robust documentation for the people that are consuming your APIs to quickly onboard, right? And making sure the learning curve is not steep. That's where the dev portal comes in. So just a quick primer on API management. Now, NGINX, the open source, powers a whole variety of API management solutions, as you can see there. What I mean by that is specifically the data plane here, the traffic management piece. That's what many of these other solutions also use. So with that frame of reference, now let's get into the elements of TCO, right? I have 4 big dimensions. First and foremost, complexity, costs, and then talk about efficiency, then multi-cloud versatility. So complexity, right? So I'm going to dive a little bit into our architecture. So I apologize for getting a little bit technical and opening the hood a little bit under the hood. We're going to see. So you have these APIs, a traditional API management solution, and we now know what an API management solution is. By traditional, I'm just going to call out some names: Apigee, IBM Data Connect. These have been around for 10 years maybe. They were developed for the age of what I call north-south traffic. So again, you have applications outside your data center consuming APIs that you have published, right? So they have a traditional API management system. A request comes in, there's a control plane, data plane. The data plane again is the component that processes all the API calls, that routes an incoming API request. But what happens is, when a call is made, it has to go through the control plane, go through some scripts, there's a database, then the data plane, and then finally it hits the backend. This control plane handles, again, request routing, load balancing, quota management, rate limiting, fine-grained access control. Many cases, every call that gets processed, a database lookup needs to happen to figure out if the rate limit is hit or not. Yes, there could be some caching, but to process an API call, there is significant overhead. What we have done is to decouple that, right? Decouple, when a call is made, the request directly is handled by the data plane. All of the elements I mentioned, again, rate limiting, content-based routing, is all handled in memory because of the power of, that's how NGINX was designed from the ground up. NGINX was, designed originally, and we're just using that architecture for the purpose of API, to process API calls as well, right? Now, so what are the advantages? That's sort of the what of our architecture. What does it mean from what are the benefits, right? You get really high performance. Capital One is able to process billions of API requests within just 10 milliseconds. We have a case study. You're going to get the same high performance wherever the API, regardless of where the API gateway is deployed, north-south or east-west. So what is east-west? East-west traffic is mainly traffic within your data center between all the microservices, just internally, right? Many API management solutions, they're coming up with a new component called microgateway, specifically to handle east-west traffic. They have a whole bunch of other components. I have a slide on that, but they have an additional component called microgateway that also needs to be deployed and managed to, again, handle the east-west traffic. With NGINX, you don't need that. Talking about microservices, it's container, microservices goes hand in hand usually with adoption of containers. You need to be able to ensure your gateway and perhaps your control plane also can be deployed on containers. Our gateway is really small footprint. It can fit into a floppy. We did a, if you guys remember what a floppy is. So my point is, if the microservice itself is very micro and tiny, you can't have a 10 GB gateway fronting traffic for that microservice. It just doesn't make sense, right? So, and you're reducing the, what do I mean by reducing the complexity? Not to, again, Apigee Edge architecture, their private cloud, they have a public cloud as well. You have all of these components: Zookeeper, the standard database, Cupid server, PostgreSQL. Now, I want to be very careful. We also have a database. Controller requires a database. But in order to process an API call, it's all handled by the data plane. The database is involved for monitoring, to keep track of all the metrics and monitoring purposes, right? So the overhead is not needed in our architecture to process an API call. Unlike you have API Connect IBM on the other side, again, 4 different servers to set up. My point is they were, again, designed for, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years back, right? There were no containers or microservices, and it's just so happened that they've not sort of evolved for this age, is my point, right? So I'll pause here. Questions? Anybody using any legacy API management solution? Do you agree with that? Do you agree with some of the complexity?
They're working on it, but you're right, it's old.
Right.
It's the same thing. A lot of clients are working on it. I wouldn't say use it per se, but dabbling in it, having challenges.
Especially, that's what we are seeing, especially as they adopt microservices. Okay, so now let's look at costs, right? So our approach to pricing, first and foremost, only charge successful API calls. You make an API call, there's a DDoS attack, we will not charge you for that, right? There's a bad request, unavailability, we're going to charge you only for successful API calls. It's predictable, fair, we're not going to penalize you as you grow, as you have more and more APIs. Again, I've already shamed, but Apigee sometimes prices based on not just, they also have tiers. They have consumption-based price, what I call consumption-based pricing, most of these vendors. But Apigee also adds in restrictions around only 2 users, this many number of gateways, right? This many number of APIs, so discrete APIs, actually. We don't have any of that, just based on the number of, again, successful API calls processed. So I do have some hard numbers. So I've compared a legacy API management solution, IBM on the right-hand side, and then cloud, then NGINX, right? We have a tiered structure, and the tiered pricing goes further down to 1 trillion. Everybody has a tiered structure. It's just that I mean, you can look at IBM, right? It's $100 per 100,000 API calls, and and they do discount it up to, if you're gonna process 1 billion calls, it goes down to $16 per 100,000 calls. But I mean, even taking into account all of that, this is list price. You're looking at 10 million for if you're going to process 5 billion API calls, right? We have some customers and prospects who are talking in the range of 500 billion, right? So this is just not going to be. This is just sheer licensing costs. Bear in mind they have to take into account the complexity that I talked about. Somebody had a question? Somebody had a no? Okay. What is interesting is, so that's just pure dollars to dollars licensing costs. With AWS, you have to take into account all of these other things, right? Data transfer costs, they charge you, it's piecemeal pricing. They charge you separate for CloudWatch monitoring, caching. Caching is by hour. AWS also, the actual API calls processed is based on number of API calls processed. This much for 1 million and whatnot. But for caching, it's very little, but it adds up. But because it's charged, it's based on per hour, 0.05 per hour, but that also adds up, right? If you have private link, again, data transfer costs. On the legacy side, you have the infrastructure and the actual servers, VMs, if you're having it on a private cloud, databases, whatnot, networking costs that you need to incur, as well as the INO resources. So let me give you a concrete example. That's where the efficiency comes in, right? So I'm going to use the age-old adage, do more with less, but there's a customer here, Mobilecom Debitel, one of our customers who's replaced Apigee with NGINX API Gateway, not API Management, API Gateway. I want to be very clear. They had been using NGINX as an API Gateway for a long time, for about 1 year before we launched our API Management product. But this is the effect. 33 VMs to 2, right? They had to allocate just half a resource for the upkeep of Apigee because of all of this on the left-hand side, right? Each and every component here has to be upgraded. You need to dedicate infrastructure. Also, performance hops. I mean, the hops involved perhaps, or not exactly hops, but sometimes there is a Cassandra as well, right? So there are some hops involved in terms of actually processing the API, which could potentially have an impact on performance. The same survey that I mentioned, IDC survey, good 60% mentioned they're looking at 20 millisecond response time for an API call, right? So going back to this customer, again, went from 33 VMs to 2, and he had to dedicate half a resource just for upkeep of Apigee, right? We are not saying it'll be zero with NGINX, but it's certainly, you don't need somebody just for maintaining NGINX, right? And you're certainly, this customer went to 2 VMs. Finally, multi-cloud versatility. I guess everybody in this room, I'm guessing, I shouldn't assume. How many are using multiple clouds? We are seeing a ratio. We are saying this, 87% from our state of the application services report, from F5 state of the application services report. I think this is probably pretty common. So what that means is, in the previous presentation, Liam, our product manager, he was talking about a distributed microservices distributed framework. First and foremost, you can deploy the gateways, the component that processes API traffic, what I call where the apps and APIs are. So if you have the apps, APIs in AWS, right? Azure, whatever clouds you're using, you want a gateway that's closer to where the apps and APIs are, right? But you can have your controller, wherever you want it, whichever environment is convenient to you, whether on premise, in AWS, or in some Google Cloud or whatever, right? So my point is, wherever the apps and APIs are, you can deploy the gateways there to process traffic, to manage the traffic, and the control plane can be deployed wherever it's convenient to you. This kind of architecture has been, our customers use this kind of architecture, especially again because going back to the discussion about decoupling the data plane and control plane, that's what allows this distributed deployment pattern, right? You can really have your gateways anywhere you want, and the control plane can be anywhere. Nasty surprises, you're not reliant on the cloud providers, load balancing, API gateway, because every cloud provider have, first and foremost, I think, especially in the load balancing side, they provide bare minimum, just enough solution. Anything advanced, enterprise grade, they don't offer. But you're not, again, reliant on the idiosyncrasies of the cloud provider's traffic management solution. You're using the same NGINX, same solution on an environment. You're getting consistent performance results, especially on the performance side, and performance and stability, and I would say costs as well, right? Because we kind of saw what is perhaps relevant to this presentation is a cost conversation, where you're going to suddenly see a spike when you have a lot of traffic that you're not prepared for. That's a general cloud issue, right? Do you guys agree with some of the benefits laid out here in terms of multi-cloud? See some people nodding. And what, again, a summary slide that we learned from the report is, the barriers to API adoption, complexity, security, which I just touched upon a little bit, the full lifecycle governance. These are some of the barriers to API adoption, and simplicity, ease of use. Again, that complexity aspect in terms of dealing with a whole bunch of components, dealing with multiple clouds, and reducing the complexity, number of components, container friendly, lightweight, all of those things. That's what the report pointed out. Questions? Does you guys agree with some of these ROI, TCO, methodology, numbers? You can challenge me on the numbers if you don't agree. Yes.
I have a question with regards to, you listed IBM and you listed AWS, obviously those are hosted solutions.
So,
NGINX has to sit somewhere, right?
right.
I know there's a sizing guide, but
Yeah.
ballpark.
Yeah. So good point. Yeah. There's a sizing guide, so you can deploy the gateways on any cloud on premise servers that are $12,000 roughly. I can give you the exact specs, and the controller can also be deployed on a server that's similar, $12 to $20,000. So you're looking at the infrastructure cost within $50K. The point about multi-cloud, your point about hosted solutions, IBM again. So I mentioned you can have your gateways anywhere. With IBM or Apigee, you can't do that because those solutions can operate only in that cloud, or for that matter, AWS, right? You can't take IBM, you're gonna have Alessandro here talk about API Management Bake Off, where we did performance benchmarking against us, IBM, and other solutions, and we tried their cloud. We tried to deploy IBM in another environment, or we just couldn't. Right? It only operates in IBM, so you can't even have that flexibility. So thanks for bringing that up. But in terms of NGINX, yes, it's roughly, and 50K is really on the high end, actual on-premise. The real benefit would be this, right? Again, in the case of Apigee or in the case of IBM, you have all those 4 different servers. With NGINX, it's as many gateways as you want, depending on, but you don't have, Zookeeper and analytics server and all of these other things, right? That's the biggest advantage. Any other questions? Yes.
So the other question I have, and you may not be able to answer this, but is NGINX API Management planning on offering that as a service?
Yes. So not immediately. Not in the near future, I guess. But there are longer term plans. With the acquisition, especially, we can think about some of those hosted offerings. So I can only mention that at a strategic level, at a longer term roadmap level, we are thinking along those lines. Nothing definitive and nothing certain. Right. I think, to your point, what would be valuable is for folks to have the distributed gateways to be deployed wherever they want, but perhaps a hosted analytics and a monitoring and all of that, right? So they get the flexibility, almost like a micro gateway, as in have the gateway closer to where you want to process the API calls, but in terms of administration of it, do it from a hosted solution. Perhaps that's what we're looking at. Yes.
One thing is about thinking about banking industry. I mean, what things you missing in terms of features?
Yes. So
if we want to go there, what do we have to bear in mind to be effective?
Absolutely. So right now, flipping this, the ones in gray, the 2 big feature set that we don't have today are the analytics and the dev portal. Not just for banking, but if you especially have external APIs, these 2 features are much sought after, right? Dev portal is coming. I'm just going to leave it at that, in the sense that you're here for the conf. I think I'm giving you enough hints. There's some announcements that we're going to make tomorrow. So that's coming, right? We also have Swagger importing existing APIs. That is also something that we are working on. Just definitely attend tomorrow's keynote. Did I answer your question?
Well, yeah, it's I was thinking about one of the partners you have there. It's Okta.
Right.
They're doing some specific additional security things, right? So what are those that you're missing there? I mean, it's not complete. It's kind of complete against other. We go to the line to offer this.
So, especially on the security side, we do integrate with Okta. So the way we integrate is you can create JOT tokens, perhaps from the Okta platform, and then use those tokens when you define the APIs. So from banking standpoint, we have an API for checking, and that can only be accessed by certain authorized folks. You can set those fine-grained permissions in API management itself. So if the bank is using Okta for authentication authorization, they can use Okta for that purpose. We will take that credentials and validate against that. Today we can do that. We also have another partnership with Ping Identity, so that is also coming up. I would say on the security side, I think we have a pretty good story. Yeah, we may not. I think banking has certain. I forget the regulation.
ESD2
Yeah, we don't.
in Europe.
Say it again. Two-factor authentication is handled by Okta. Multi-factor, yes, but there's a particular standard. We're not probably having. We're not compliant with that yet. The specific to banking, I'm talking about. But general authentication, authorization, and all that we do. Yeah. Yes, and I've sort of talked about how bad the other solutions are, but yes, we do lack certain features, but we are closing the gap on that. Other questions? Any thoughts on our pricing model in terms of, again, I feel we are pretty differentiated on just charging only for successful API calls and not creating artificial constraints like the number of gateways or the number of users. This has resonated well with our customers. So, yes.
So, I have a question on this. You're kind of just saying off of using NGINX to replace that solution. But they also have a per consumption model.
Who does?
Sorry?
Who does?
Apogee or.
Right, of course.
We actually have both solutions. So, but one of the things that might be reference for NGINX is that it's CPU based, right? It's process based. Are you saying that if you want to use, and what delimits that, right? Like, so you talked about GWT validation, that comes out of the box. And that, like, if I want to consume Swagger documents, does that mean it? Or does that mean when I have this new module in the controller, I have to start paying per transaction cost, if I'd rather pay per instance run?
So the API management that we offer is basically you get controller and the gateways together.
Okay.
And it's only tiered pricing. So there's no separate cost for JOT authentication. There's no separate price for
No, I get
Swagger
that
import.
part, but I mean, like, right now, if I just have the gateways with
Oh, yeah.
NGINX Plus, right?
Yeah.
That's like per PU, right?
Yeah, that's basically per license, meaning NGINX Plus, how many ever NGINX Plus instances you want.
Right.
And all of the functionality, like there's nothing separate for JOT. It's just, we can get into NGINX Plus features, but Plus capabilities, but it's charged on a per unit, not
Right,
per.
per unit. There's no per unit model for transaction
No, it's based on the
on the call.
the tiered number of calls processed, but you get the controller and the gateway.
I get that, but I'm just kind of curious about, because we're starting to do POC, like the benefits, because it might get significantly more expensive, right? Because now you're paying per transaction. We have this with other things, right? Like transaction based on, because it could be significantly higher than utilization. I may not need more gateways per se than if I have NGINX Plus versus, what am I getting for that extra cost?
Right. So you're getting the control plane. You're getting the ability to define the APIs.
That's what I mean. It's basically being able to consume Swagger, the little dash.
The monitoring, Swagger, and then an upcoming dev portal.